So I'm sitting in my 128 and I am looking at the interior and kind of planning out what I'm going to do to it. It is fairly stock, if not completely stock. And as I mentioned in an earlier video when I kind of introduced this car, I'm kind of trying to replicate or take cues off of the European 128 Rally, which was not sold in the United States for the first series 128s. So I've removed the steering wheel and I will be replacing it, but the focus of this video is the instrument cluster. I just removed the wheel just so I have better visibility for making the video. What you'll notice on the American 128 or the non-rally is there is no tachometer, okay? So the right gauge here is just a fuel gauge and a temperature gauge, I believe. And there are some dummy lights in there, as well as the dummy lights in the center. Also, to the right, being an Italian car, has an ashtray. The 128 Rally had a set of gauges that went in this opening and a cluster with a tachometer. So I'm going to convert this car to the 128 instruments. So let's start with the simpler one. So this is an original 128 gauge pod that goes in that opening, and it has the Veglia Borletti water and oil gauges. Okay, if you look at the back of them, the wires that you see cut there are for the lights, and then you see the little spade connectors for the signals. Okay, so this is going to go here, and the other component is a European cluster. So the European cluster is in kilometers per hour, and I thought about converting this to miles per hour, and I still may at some point by switching basically the left dial from my original cluster to it. But the big thing I'm after is this guy, right? So it's a tachometer. So I'm going to walk through the process of installing these. And installing them is simple, but getting them to work is slightly more challenging. So why is this not like a straightforward plug and play modification? It mostly is, but with this not being equipped with a tachometer, tachometers need a signal from the ignition coil. So in order to get this to work, we do have to run a wire from behind the cluster area to the ignition coil, which is basically located on the inner fender. Specifically to the negative terminal on the ignition coil. You run that wire and connect it to the input on the back of this guy, and tachometer is addressed. So the part that's a little trickier is connecting these gauges, specifically because these gauges require sending units that send a range of inputs, right, in order for the gauge to read out, because these aren't mechanical gauges, they're electric. So they're working on electronic impulse. And the base model vehicle, for instance, the oil gauge, right? So oil pressure here is actually a measurement, whereas here, the oil pressure is just a indicator light. So this sending unit is like an on-off sending unit. It's not sending a voltage range to kind of power a gauge. So it normally would just go on if the oil pressure dropped below a certain pressure. Up above here, I'm a little not 100% sure, because I always thought these cars, from reading on them, also had a light, an indicator light for the water temperature. Basically, the light would come on if there was some abnormality with the temperature that the car was operating at. This car has an actual gauge. So I don't know if this was an American market thing, I don't know. But traditionally, if it had the light, you also would have to get the sending unit for the water temperature or coolant temperature for the same exact reason. Okay, so I'm going to look at that. I have the sensors. So these are the sending units. So this is the oil pressure sending unit. And it has just a single spade connector, and I'll put links and part information in the description below. So this is the oil sending unit, and this is the coolant temperature, water temperature sending unit as well. So we will check these, we will install them, and then there's slight modifications to the wiring harness, the connectors, to get this all to work. So it's really the one screw here at the base of the instrument cluster. Which is out. And now, pry. Gently. So it was stuck in there pretty good. So I had to get in there with a pry tool. And there's all sorts of nastiness behind it that I got to vacuum out. So I cleaned it out a little bit. I got to vacuum more because I can't really get the cluster out very far because you have to unscrew the speedometer cable. So you reach behind it. There's like a knurled nut on it or collar, and you just unscrew it. Okay, so now we get a little more room here and more vacuuming. So with all that additional vacuuming done, and the speedometer cable disconnected, there's really these two main plugs. There's like this red one and then this white one. And out comes the cluster. As simple as that. So the rally cluster has the same two plugs, and obviously the location for the speedometer to be threaded on. But it does require splicing in those wires I was referring to, like the one for the tachometer specifically, and for the gauges. But what's nice is, like, if you were installing an aftermarket set of gauges, or like we'll start with an aftermarket tachometer, you have to supply it ground, you have to supply it the accessory power, you have to supply it light, right? So like you have to, you know, tap into a wire from like your light switch, so when the interior lights are on, so are those, as well as that signal wire from the coil. So what's cool about using this is you're getting all that, the ground, the lighting, the accessory power. We really just have to provide the signal. So with that out, now we got to remove the ashtray. So the ashtray, to like empty it, is you just go in and compress, right? That's the ashtray itself. But now we got to get this casing out. So I actually just popped out the light switch, so I could get, if the casing around here is like crimped a little bit, so I could actually kind of push from here and push down on it to get it out of the way. And I noticed, so like I said, I found some evidence of, you know, like mice or something having nested in here at one point, and they actually chewed a lot of the insulation off these wires that go to my light switch. So I will repair all that before I button this all back up together. this actually doesn't fit directly. So it looks like I will have to open this up a little bit right here, which is not that big of a deal. I'm going to remove the gauges to see if to work on actually getting the bracket, if you will, installed. Figure out how much trimming I need to do on this dash pad. This cluster I got, or this pod I got, doesn't fit the opening of the North American dashboard. Well, specifically it fits, but the gauges won't fit in here. And you can see all this material in here, right there, and across the bottom here. Across the bottom here, this needs to be clear in order for the big round gauge to slide in. So I'm going to trace this here and here in this bottom section here, and then in this little tab here, and then go in there with like my Dremel with the little cutting wheel on it and trim all that. So with all that excess material removed, the two gauges slide right into the pod. And then I was also able to, as you can see with the screw there, there was enough of the steel underneath the dash available there to, I used like a little pilot drill to make sure I was able to get a hold of it, and then used a little self-tapping screw to secure the pod in place. I also installed the European cluster. It fits like OEM, fits perfectly. The screw hole aligned perfectly with the North American model. So the gauges are mounted physically. I am going to end this video here and start a new video, a part 2 for this installation, going over the wiring and the modifications needed to get the accessory gauges there working properly, the tachometer working properly, and still retaining some of the dummy lights that are part of the original cluster. So stay tuned for that.